Dan Rubin.
Thank you. That was the most interesting introduction I've ever had. How are you guys doing? Good? Yes? It's a fantastic conference so far, isn't it? And great venue. I want tables like this all the time. It's like dinner theater the entire time through. So what I was originally going to title this talk, I was going for, I hear that. He's firing on burst mode for his pictures for me, apparently. I was shooting for the longest topic and title that I could possibly get and fit on one slide and still manage to explain everything I'm going to cover. So originally this was the title, but that was a little extreme. So what we're actually going to be talking about is ultimately hands-on prototyping here. Now I'm a designer, I'm also a front-end developer, and I've been a front-end developer since the web came to be, but I was a designer before that. So I'm actually one of like the first hybrids, but it was completely unintentional because I only became a developer on the front end because there was no one else to do it. I was designer, and you know how many designers in the room? Yep, keep your hands up if you're a control freak. Yep, all of you, okay, good. And how many developers have worked with a designer who's a control freak? There we go, and all the rest of the hands come up. So, so what I'm going to be speaking about here is kind of it touches on usability, it touches on usability testing and rapid prototyping, which is something we all work with or should work with. But it's done especially for, I think, designers or people who aren't developers might not think about this stuff. And I want to explain how this can affect what you do. Now, I'm going to cover a lot of stuff, and I'm going to go as quickly through all of it as I can. But just in case there are any questions that come up during, I'm going to check Twitter. I know we don't have Q&A time built into any of these sessions, so if you have questions, either come up and find me after the session or this evening, or ask me on Twitter. So if you need to reach me, that's me, and I will respond to absolutely every question that gets asked. So diving in, there's a big problem with usability testing. Not with the testing itself. The problem is that most companies, agencies, freelancers don't take it seriously enough, if they do it at all. How many of you, either in your company or yourself, participate in usability testing, run usability tests on any kind of basis? Okay, so not even half of you. And this is a problem because it ends up being kind of shuffled off into the area of responsibility of UX people, user experience people, or just specifically anyone who works with usability. It's not something designers or developers or managers or anyone else has to worry about. And that's a huge problem, especially because I treat design as not just the visual design, not just the interaction design. Design is what we all do. And that's not to belittle any other title. It's not a title. Design, we design products, we design experiences. Design is the art of creative problem solving, whether you do it through code or through experience or through visual design, whatever you do, that's what we're doing. We're all design teams of some sort or another. And with testing and the concept of any kind of design and creation and problem solving being so far apart, being something that you just do every once in a while, if you do it at all, we're losing a major opportunity to make the things that we make better. So this applies whether you're a designer, a developer, in marketing, if you're the owner of a business. You need to understand the value of testing as much as possible, especially while a design is being created, while any product is being created. And the reason why is that if you combine design and usability testing, the entire process you test throughout at regular intervals, you improve everything. You improve the strategy, you improve the engineering, you improve the visual design, you improve the interaction, and the whole experience and the flow from one end to the other. And this is important because that's what we're trying to do. And unless we have feedback throughout the process about what we're trying to do, there's no way that we're going to accurately, it's going to be a lot of guesswork. And I mean, there's still guesswork involved even when you test, because you have to interpret the test results a lot of the time, but you're on much more solid ground. So I'm going to present a little bit of a case study, because this combination kind of design and usability testing leads to all sorts of discovery, which ends up resulting in a better end product, a better experience. And that's what we're all trying to do. Right? I don't know anyone in this industry who intentionally tries to make horrible products. Are you out there? If you're here, you should leave. Yes, you, sir, out. So the idea here is that I'm going to present a case study. So this is actual work, which also means some of it's boring, because a lot of actual work is kind of boring and unsexy and not the kind of stuff that you'll put in a portfolio. We feel lucky when we get those projects, but that's not always the case. But this is a fantastic case study of a project that integrated usability testing into a bit of a design process, a creative process, and allowed us to discover all sorts of user behavior that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to discover. We wouldn't have guessed it ourselves, as experienced as the team working on this project was. And it's one of those things that when it comes to what users will do, the one thing you can always guarantee is that they'll always surprise you. You can't quite ever predict everything they're going to do. So a little bit of a setup to this. One of the things that I see going on when people do test is that there's an approach to usability testing that's often very version-centric. Like we build, or we design, do prototypes, whatever it is, and then we test at this point. And then we go away and we build again, and we do a whole lot of other stuff, and then we reach another big milestone, and then we test again. Which isn't a problem. It isn't a big deal, but it's basically not setting us up to do what we're really good at, which is solve problems all the time. As long as we don't have a constant input of problems to solve, we just kind of slip into guesswork and are making decisions based on experience. And this idea of building a version and then testing that version, however many users are testing that, whether it's a mock-up, a prototype, whatever it happens to be, leads us to putting more effort into the thing we're going to test. And therefore, what we test while we test it is very unchangeable, unflexible. And I think that also means that we lose the opportunity to refine interactions, to change things on the fly, to experiment, to do like A/B testing in the middle of a test. But the major thing that it leads to is that extra work. So we don't want to do that extra work. There's usually not time to do that extra work to fully test something. So what do we do when we prototype? We do very low fidelity prototypes. We do clickable prototypes, like clickable wireframes, more like. Because to do something that looks like the final product for a test, especially earlier on in a product's life cycle, is very labor intensive. Maybe we feel like we can't do it. To make a fully interactable prototype that looks like the final product, we're not there yet, so we're not at the final product, so we can't test something that looks like the final product. Well, of course, users react differently when they're looking at something and using something that doesn't look like whatever the end product that you have in mind is going to look like. We can still learn a lot from that. You can learn a lot from paper prototyping and clickable wireframes and doing all sorts of different things, but user behavior will be different. They know they're not working with the real thing, and so even if they're not fully conscious of that, if it's subconscious interactions that change, there is a change. And we lose opportunities there because the first time that we can test the final level design is really late in the process, and we've already made a lot of decisions by that point. So my question is, what if it was easy to test production level final quality looking visual design as well, and interaction and flow, something that to the user looked and felt like something that was real. And in order for us to do that, we need to have a pretty easy way to do that too, I think. Because if it's too hard, we won't do it because there's never enough time and never enough budget. So this project that we're going to talk about is exactly that. We had to solve that problem. We didn't have enough time to produce something very high fidelity, but I felt that we'd get a lot more benefit out of it. And even go further, to be able to adjust that prototype during the sessions. I wanted it to be very flexible. So a little bit about the project itself. The team that worked on this was pretty fantastic. Have any of you heard of Jared Spool? Yes, nods and raised hands. Fantastic expert in the world of usability. He's pretty much one of the handful of people who founded the idea of usability testing, especially with software, 25, 30 years ago. And his company, UIE, has worked with everyone from 37 Signals to NASA on this kind of stuff. So he brought me in and a couple of other people, David and Hagen Rivers, who you've probably never heard of, but I guarantee you if you've been around the web long enough, you've used stuff that both of them have designed. Hagen, among other things, was the original designer of Netscape. Remember Netscape Navigator? You remember that? She designed the UI for version 1, version 2, hired the team that designed the UI for version 3. She's been around the web and interaction design for a very long time. Both of them worked at Apple as well. So we had Jared working on leading and facilitating this usability test that we were hired to do, and the other three of us doing the interaction design for what would be tested. The primary goal here, I'll talk a bit about how we did the testing as well in a second. This was for a client that made a very boring product to most of you, and possibly something none of you ever use or use anymore. How many of you write checks anymore? That's what I thought. Oh, one guy? Yep. Oldest guy in the room? No? Yeah, yes, okay. So the client was the largest check manufacturer in the United States, which is actually a pretty big business still in the US, because a lot of people still write checks, and they produce and print the checks for a lot of banks and everything else. So one of their online storefronts, which made a ridiculous amount of money every year for what they do, which is just sell personalized checks, they wanted to improve the e-commerce flow. This is a very boring way of saying improve the way that someone gets from entering the site to checking out and having paid. But they felt that they could do it a whole lot better. They were doing pretty well already, pretty well in the way of making $75 to $80 million a year off this one really crappy, as you'll see, site. But they knew they could do better. Well, here's how crappy it was, really, because you can't understand. Designers all just died a little bit. It just shows things don't have to be pretty to be successful and make money, sadly. And we just all lose our jobs. So you can see that kind of there's a lot of density of information in these designs, a lot of structural weakness. There were two actual sites that we got hired to work on and improve in this small little project. And it was short. I'll give you the timelines in a minute. The other site was another brand that they owned that did all sorts of printed crap, mostly. It really was. But fantastic sites, right? Really great. This other site, I don't know what I can't remember what their profit was each year, but it was still in the double-digit millions. And it's like, really? A lot of people will buy crap in the States, apparently. But that's not surprising. So you can see that, again, a lot of information density, structural weakness, all this other stuff. Our job was to go in there and tell them how they could make this better. So the first part of this was we actually split the project into two usability tests. The first part was an inherent value test. Are any of you familiar with that? Almost none. Okay, good. I think an inherent value test is like one of the most fantastic tests to run. You can tie it into a competitive evaluation as well, because you're essentially doing the same thing. You want to see what's working with what you have. You want to find out the inherent value, hence the name, of what you already have, so you don't break it when you start to improve things. This is something we don't think about enough, that if you have something, if you're working on redesigning or improving or iterating, whatever it is, or even you're thinking about a new product, you can look at competitors, anyone that's existing in the market, to see what people love already and make sure that you don't break that. Knowing what people love and protecting it is very, very important. So the way we ran this first test, and again, these two sites that we had to work with. We ran it, only 26 users, so split between the two projects, which might seem like a small amount to some of you who have run much larger tests. Jared, and as the expert he is, and as much experience as he has, I'll defer to him. He doesn't think you need a lot of users. You just need enough to get a good mixture, a good blend, and as long as you select them correctly, that's plenty. So the first site, the check site, we spent 3/4 of an hour for each test. That's all we needed for that, per user. And the other site, because the process was a little bit more complicated, they could do all sorts of customization to business cards and other things and pull their logo in and other things. We spent 1.5 hours per user. And it was only 6 days for this, so we spanned it over about 2 weeks because there were 2 locations in the US. And this was our test that gave us all the information that we needed to go and process and then produce both a prototype, which was the original plan, a prototype of improvements to test, as well as all sorts of recommendations that kind of fell outside of the umbrella of what we could prototype in that time. The difference in time, again, was due to the differences in complexity of each flow for each product. We made sure that for every test, as many people from each of the organizations, each of the clients' organizations, were invited to observe the test as possible. This was a key thing. If you're doing any kind of usability testing, make sure that you invite people from the client's organization to see it. It doesn't matter who they are. You don't just want the people who are the stakeholders and who are going to sign off. The more people within an organization can understand what's working and what's not, and actually understand what the end users have to go through, we often end up being very, very far removed from that process when we work inside, whether it's us who create this stuff and build it, or it's other people who are our clients who build things or offer them to clients, to their customers rather. So in this audience, our observers, we had everyone from designers, programmers, managers, customer service reps, advertising and marketing. The CEO sat in on some of them. It was open to all. And I got to say that the greatest thing about that was this one guy from accounting came and sat in on more of the sessions than anyone, took a stack of notes. This guy was in accounting. Technically, nothing he did in his daily routine had anything to do with what users experienced. He couldn't fix things on the site. He couldn't design things for the site. He wasn't doing anything there. He was just making sure the books were right for the company. But he became interested and passionate about it because he'd never seen it before. And I think that's it's interesting on two levels. One, it gives you, and this is very important, it gives you buy-in, easier buy-in from the client. If the client sees things breaking, you now don't have to go and explain what broke. You say, hey, as you know, remember when our second user was using this and it just broke horribly and they were frustrated and threw their chair to the ground. And they're like, yeah, we know. We know it was horrible. And it worked beautifully. Having those observers meant that our job was done for the most part as far as explaining what we were going to do next as soon as the tests were done. They went, yep, we know how horrible it is now. And they also knew what was great. Now, an interesting thing from this inherent value test, there were a lot of things that worked. Their site, as ugly as it might be to those of us who are designers, and as crowded and packed as it might be, and I know there are content strategists in here probably looking at it and just cringing because there's just too much and it's all crap. There were a lot of things that worked. However, there were the things that didn't work, though they were few. When they broke, when the things failed, they failed hard. They were major failures, major pain points for the user. And we got all of this out of just these simple inherent value tests. So this process allowed us to learn everything that worked and keep track of it so we wouldn't break it unintentionally. And ultimately, we all, including all of the observers from the client, we all suffered through what didn't work. And suffer we did. Ordering checks shouldn't take you more than about 5 to 10 minutes. And their process, some of those users used up all 45 minutes struggling to finish their purchase. It's painful to watch. So we took that information, and then it was our job to come up with recommendations. Now, on my side was to improve the interaction design wherever I could. Now, the brief itself included room for improvement, but they specifically did not want a redesign. They'd had one before. They'd run a round of testing a number of years prior, and from that had resulted a complete redesign, and they'd flipped the switch on the redesign and launched it, and it was supposed to fix all the problems. And what happened was over the first week, their sales tanked, like absolutely tanked, bad enough that it panicked the entire company. This was a few years before we went in and did our test. But it freaked them out, and they flipped back to the old site and didn't touch anything since. And the old site, as you can see, is like classic 1998. Right, so, and we did this project actually in late 2009, but it's still kind of a lot of valid lessons here. So there were room for improvements, but like minor change and everything, but they really didn't want existing users especially to get confused or put off in any way. They did not want to do things that would make them lose money. That was against the goal. So when I went and like kind of evaluated what was wrong based on what we'd seen and just what I know as a designer, The biggest thing that we saw in these inherent value tests was that there was just a ton of inconsistency in their design. So as crappy as it was, crappy and consistent is still kind of easy enough to use. But they also had inconsistencies from screen to screen throughout the flow. Things would just move at random, or the way a button would look one place for the primary call to action was completely different on another screen. And so users couldn't actually build up any kind of patterns, even if they were existing users, because we tested a mixture. We tested about 50% were existing customers, and then 50% were customers who were in the right market but had probably bought from a competitor or something like that. And they were all ready to purchase as well, so we knew that they were selected correctly. So they had no rules in place. New pages would be created just haphazardly on the fly with almost no consistency. So the first thing that I knew we had to do to just give them some ground to stand on was to implement like some sort of shared grid, consistent typography, basic things that I knew we could recommend and wouldn't really change the design at all. And it would also help their design teams because they had internal design teams. So implementing all this stuff that we all do and giving them some sort of style guide that they could work from, I knew would help. But that wasn't quite enough for me, as you can tell. So this is, and again, I told you this was not a sexy project because there wasn't room for design. The entire time span from finishing the rounds of inherent value tests to having to fly back and do our prototyping test was like 10 days. Maybe like 10 calendar days, so not even 2 full working weeks. So there wasn't even time for it, and they specifically didn't ask for it, but I'm a designer. I looked at it and I thought, you know what, I know they don't want to redesign, but based on what I've saw, because I sat through every one of those tests, I know that we can improve certain things that I know from experience won't break when we test it again with existing users. I know that because of how infrequently these users use this, they won't notice, which a lot of us know, but it was easier for me to make that decision, so to kind of clean it up. The same for the other site, which it was, again, when you have like 2 days to kind of do this, because then you've got to get into figuring out how to build a prototype, there's only so much you can do. This kind of thing doesn't go in my portfolio, because it's not my favorite bit of design work. It's not like great. I couldn't do everything I wanted to, but I could still make it better in that time. So the focus for me was just pretty simple. Simplicity, clarity, and an outcome. Simplify everything that you have, get rid of any of the decoration, even though it might feel a little bit more boring, and focus all of the attention as much as possible on the default action that you want the user to achieve on each, or perform on each page. So very outcome-based. There's an important lesson here before we go on to the prototype. If you design primarily for, or only for, I prefer only for, user behavior, I mean, trying to ignore the business goals as you solve the problems, layering in the business goals afterwards, or checking in to the business goals as you go, you come up with a more successful end result. Most of the problems that we saw, once we actually kind of dug into them, we saw all these horrible things and we spoke with the people who made it that way. It ended up being that all those decisions were not based on what was best for the users, for their customers. It was based on the business saying, well, we need to do this, with no justification for, well, is that right or wrong for our customers? And I think that designing for the user, for your customers, that should be your primary business goal. You make them happy, and they're going to reward you. So it actually, this is kind of a cheating way of saying that you're actually changing the priorities around, making the user and the customer your primary business goal, and it works out in your favor, which it did for these guys. Though it'd be funny if it didn't, wouldn't it? If I put all this through and we talked about all this and I said at the end, and the project was a massive failure. Thank you. That would be hilarious, the punchline. So for the prototype, no one's ever done that, because why would you do that? But it would be funny. The main requirement that we came up with was to create something that was realistic. Now, the reason I wanted to do something that was realistic is that, and we talked about it, Jared and I agreed that we'd get better results in the limited time that we'd have to test the prototype if the prototype looked like the real thing. So if we could skip over all the pretense of explaining to someone why they were going to be moving pieces of paper around or pointing at something like we do with paper prototypes, or why we were just going to do a wireframe, which we had initially discussed, and deal with all of the potential repercussions of that once we gave it to the client and them not necessarily understanding what we did, all these things that some of you have probably seen. My thought was, well, let's test the real thing. We tested the real thing for for the inherent value test, let's make it feel to the user like we're testing something real. So the goal was make it in browser, so the environment was comfortable, and make it as realistic as possible. And this goes back to that low fidelity or high fidelity discussion. Low fidelity is good, it's valuable, we learn a lot from it, but a high fidelity prototype is much, much better. And that's because of the suspension of disbelief, essentially. If you're not thinking that this thing isn't real and this won't work for me, if you're thinking, oh, this is something that real, it should work, your behavior is going to be very, very different. And we found this. This was proven. The additional requirement we came up with is that we wanted, because we were only doing a short test, we wanted to be able to iterate on our improvements throughout the testing process when we were testing this prototype, to give the client as much value for our time as possible. And this isn't necessarily thought of as something that's easy to do, and maybe some people also don't like doing it, but we knew that based on our experience, if we saw something go wrong, that we made the wrong decision in improving something, we wanted to be able to fix it quickly rather than spend another couple of days testing the wrong thing. There wasn't any sense in testing the wrong thing over and over and over again. And this opportunity to improve things as we observed them breaking was something we really needed in. So the solution to this, like how do you do that? How do you have less than a week after going through like the design process, deciding what you're going to solve, and then you've got, we had like 2 days left in the time before flying back to actually design the prototype, or build the prototype, sorry. So the solution was to not build anything. And it's one of those things that's it's so obvious that so surprisingly few people have actually tried this. Now what I'm going to show you here, I'm going to do what you're never supposed to do, but in this conference everyone seems to have done like live coding of some sort. So I'm not going to do live coding, but what I am going to do, let's hide this. Oh, let's hide that too. So let's start in Photoshop for a second. I'm just going to show you actually how we put this thing together, because it ended up being incredibly flexible and allowed us to do a whole ton of stuff in a really short period of time when we worked with the prototype. So just to prove to you that everything was just in Photoshop, this was, if you've worked with Photoshop and you've worked with like layer comps, it's a fantastic way to quickly refer to a lot of stuff in one screen, or in one Photoshop file, which was very important because I was setting myself up here for being able to do rapid iterations, observing the prototype testing. I wanted to be able to not have to switch between files, for instance. I kind of just prepared myself to do as little work as possible during the tests. Easiest way was to put everything in Photoshop in one file. So that was easy, job done. Next, now we get into some of the code. I didn't want to build anything. I wanted a clickable prototype, but I didn't want to slice all of this up and build or code all the CSS and do everything like that it would need to make it real. So my first thought was, try Dreamweaver. Maybe I can just place things, like it'll be kind of like an image map. And no, actually that took too long because Dreamweaver is a pile of crap. Any Dreamweaver fans in here? Sorry. I'm comfortable coding things by hand, and as it turned out, what I decided to do is put as little in every HTML page as possible and use a different, as you can see here, hopefully you can see, a different HTML page for each screen that we were going to test. We were able to do this because we actually did scripted testing. This was a planned, kind of a very controlled test with specific paths that we knew we needed to test for interaction. So that allowed us to say, well, these are the main screens in this flow that we need to test various interactions on and we need to fix. These were where the problems were, basically. So it allowed me to create very simple pages just using links. Basically, what I did was code up image maps, just using CSS absolute positioning. Now, the reason this trick works really well is because you don't have to code anything. The reason that I actually left things like this, logo and cart, I didn't even have to do some of this stuff, but like, including titles, this wasn't meant to ever be actually used for anything but the test, remember. But I could put titles in, and then tooltips would still work, for instance. So I was able to do a couple of little things that would mean that the ruse, as it were, that this was something functional, was even more real to someone when they were viewing this in the browser. And again, the tests were all under our own control. The style sheets for this as well were really simple. I used a reset style sheet, which I do anyway most of the time, but this made it even easier because what I wanted was nothing on the page except a flat ping. So I had a background image that was the entire page. That's it. By setting a height to the body here, you could actually say, okay, this is the height of this page as it should scroll in the browser. And so all I had to change, essentially, other than my kind of absolute positioning, I'll show you how this actually looks a little bit. But this is how simple everything was. I think the most complicated CSS that we had, nope, it wasn't there. Wasn't there. I don't know. Nothing was complicated. Oh, here we go. Because we had some fields going. This is the most complicated style sheet that we had. Very easy to change. Absolute positioning works really consistently in all the browsers we needed to test. So I just needed to move things that we needed to be clickable around the screen. Make sense? Yes? Good. Okay. For those of you who are visual, here's another tool that shows it a little bit better. So, for instance, on the home page, the only thing that was things that were clickable were things that we knew we needed people to go through. So the cart was, if we happen to need to go back to the cart and or back to the home page and get people to the cart, we always made the logo clickable, and what we were hired to test was actually improve the flow for personal check customers. So we didn't need to worry about making business checks or stationery or sale clearance, any of these other categories clickable, because that wasn't what we were hired to test, and what we'd done our inherent value test on was the personal check product, so it didn't really matter. There's a trick to that, though, and I'll get to that in a minute. So by quickly kind of building it in such a way that I actually left this code in, so I set myself up for every anchor, I had the kind of a transparent red obvious background, so that I would just comment out when we were doing the test, and as I'm sitting in the back of the room watching someone test something be tested, if something was breaking, I could just quickly, on my view, because all the files were on a local test server, so I could update things without breaking what was happening. Even during a test, I could quickly come back into my editor, go, all right, I need to make some changes for a position, or maybe I quickly redesigned the order of some information, some content in Photoshop, saved out a ping, updated the page height if that had changed, moved around the links if those positions had changed, and then saved it out, and then I could push it to the test server for either the next subject, or if we were going to fix something. Sometimes we fix things for the same test subject. When something broke, Jared was the facilitator. He's smart enough to kind of divert them away from that. I made a fix in the back of the room, passed him a note saying, hey, when you get a chance, just loop back around to that other screen. And by that time, I had already updated it on the test server because the user wasn't testing it. He would go back and we'd do an A/B test with one user, and very, very quickly iterate. It was really, right, you can see how stupid simple this is. We're not actually building anything. It's all really consistent. We don't have to test anything, which is great. And the benefit of this was that everything scrolled, tooltips worked where we needed them, where we had them. The back button and forward button worked. It felt to users like they were using something that worked. And there's one more trick to making that work, and I'll tell you that in a second. So if we pull everything up, here's a quick reminder of how it was before. We had pages like this. This was actually one of our biggest stopping points in the entire design and the original inherent value test. People, for some reason, just could not get through this page at all. Stumbled like crazy, and this extra screen. And so what we tested was something more like this. All right, and the prototype itself, this is the prototype in Safari. Right? If you don't interact with something, there's no way for you to tell yet that this is not a real, fully coded live page. And that was the point. It looks real, so users thought it was real. Now, the way we got around them feeling horribly lost and that everything was broken and they were, thank you, and that things were breaking left and right was right before they came in for the test, the last thing we told them was, just so you know, some things won't work. It's not your fault, it's ours. That's why we have you in here to test, is to help us. So you might click on some things and they just won't work. Don't worry about it. That's us. That's why we have you here. That's why we're here to watch it. It's not your fault. Magically, that made them completely okay with stuff not breaking. They didn't get frustrated with it. You give them permission to not get frustrated with it. It's not your fault. By using that little trick, it meant that we only had to make clickable what was intended to be clickable. So other benefits here, Things like, so when I exported my Photoshop file, any form fields that we needed users to interact with, you hide them before you export, and you actually create form fields. So then when you ask someone to type something in, they can tab, they can select. In this case, we were giving them pre-selected data, so there were certain things like I didn't need to pull a whole list here, so we just didn't bother with it. I'll tell you a little bit more about the scripted test when we go on. And we could make things clickable, and it felt like you were actually doing AJAX interactions. This page we didn't get a chance to work on at all, so that was horrible and ugly. But basically, you can see each page here kind of felt appropriate. We could edit data. We could kind of have someone go back here. We could have them check. We could even do cool things like this. We wanted to test. One of our theories we had was we wanted to give people, we saw in the inherent value test, people were pogo sticking, which is one of Jared's terms, where in order to get a better view of the entire set of personalized checks, they would click into the detail view and then click out, and click in and click out, and click in and click out. And it was a lot of extra work. So we played around with things, and we came up with a little bit of a JavaScript interaction. Well, even though this is a flat file, it was really easy to drop in like 2 lines of jQuery and very quickly get this slightly more complex interaction and test that. It took no time at all to actually do it, and allowed us to, again, test the timing of popping over and off. It also allowed us to test, like in this version, you can see these little tiny icons. This is a perfect example of things we were able to iterate on during the test. We thought people would need this kind of clue or some sort of visual cue to hover over things. It turned out that they were doing it anyway and weren't noticing the icons, and we kind of thought, yeah, I don't think they're seeing those. So for the next user, we took them out very easily. I just clicked hide on all those layers, re-exported the ping. It was ready for the next user. Continued to work just as fine. We iterated very quickly because we observed this behavior. So over the course of a couple of days of testing, by using this kind of setup, we were able to make vast improvements, tiny little improvements, incremental improvements, but every single user was using a slightly better version of the prototype than the person before. And before I pop back into my slides, it worked the same whether they were in Firefox. This is Firefox, and then this is Safari. We allowed them to use whatever they were most comfortable using. So we had a PC as well there. If they were an Internet Explorer user, they could use Internet Explorer. And you know what? It looked exactly the same, and it didn't require any testing time. So we could make the users as comfortable as possible with their environment, which is what we needed to do to get the information out of them. So back into slides for the last couple of things here. Some important items about testing itself. So how we set up the tests here to round out. I said we had scripted tests. Well, this is task-specific testing. This allowed us to make something that wasn't fully functional and still get a lot of information out of it. Elements of the prototype that weren't needed for those tests were just unclickable, saved work, again. Tests were all run in the browser, as I said, based on user preference. And again, things like back and forward buttons worked. It made it as normal as we could make it. As I said, the prototype itself was different for every user, which some people might see as a bad thing, but we were seeing the entire arc of that progression. So we knew that it was different, but meaning better. We knew we would improve it. We also knew that if we tested something we thought, oh, well, that hasn't broken for the user, but we now think we can make it better, we would change it. If it didn't make it better, we revert back to the other one. We had a lot of flexibility because of this, which made the most use of the short amount of time we had to test. Because we supplied the data to people, so like the form fields, the thing that looks like an AJAX result, confirming whether this is their correct shipping address or not, we gave them a name and address to fill in. One of the tricks this is one of Jared's tricks, if you give someone something to type in, their entry process becomes exactly like they would if they were pulling that information from memory. So they type, they tab if they're a person who tabs between fields, they use their mouse if they're a person who mouses between fields. It just kind of quickly replaces it. Rather than telling them something, we just gave them a little sheet of paper, type this in, and when they're scanning the result, they're comparing it with what's on the sheet of paper the same way as they'd compare it from memory. So it actually allowed us to make it seem like we were doing something on the server side. So we were able to do, again, it's a lot of smoke and mirrors. Things that we learned from this, because this is the most important. Familiar doesn't always mean that something's the same. Now, I told you at the beginning that the client was terrified at the idea or the thought of redesigning at all. When we showed them the designs for the prototype, which The designers here, we know that they're different, but it's not like a lot of design work or anything like that. They were freaked out. They said, oh no, this is not what we wanted. We specifically told you we didn't want anything redesigned. And we said, trust us. Your existing users, when we test them on this prototype, and they were a different set of users, so they weren't people who'd come in a couple of weeks before. The existing users won't know the difference. If they do know the difference, we'll give you money back. But trust us, you'll see. You'll sit in and you'll watch. And you know what happened? We did exit interviews for every user that came in for the tests. And all of the existing users, one of the questions that we asked them was, how much do you feel this experience differs from what you're used to the last time you ordered? And the answer every single time was, well, it was faster. It was a little easier. That was it. They didn't see the difference. And we got away with this because it's not a site they use every day. If this was, Facebook, we all know what happens when Facebook changes a pixel. Right? The whole world explodes because everyone uses it every single day, multiple times a day, throughout the day, so you will notice something different. It's the same as back when people read newspapers in print, that old paper. If you had a daily paper, if something slight changed and you were a daily reader, you would notice it. As opposed to a magazine that comes out once a month or once a quarter, you might not even notice it now if it's a minor change. So the degree of change you can get away with is very closely tied to the frequency of use. This worked for us. It was easy, it was familiar, and that also works because for those users, they were more interested and concerned with where things were than what they looked like. So as long as the button that they always needed to click, that they just knew that when they needed to do reordering was up here. As long as we left it up here, didn't even have to look the same. It just had to map spatially closely enough, and they were fine. And the client, as a result, went, oh, cool. We didn't know we could do that. The other thing that was very valuable out of this was underscoring the value of inherent value testing. Because we knew what worked successfully in the customer's product, we knew what to protect in our recommendations and our design process and our testing. We knew to make sure that we tested that we hadn't broken it, and we knew not to break it, and we knew to tell to the customer, our client, make sure that you don't break this because customers love that particular tiny little interaction, or it always goes really, really smoothly because of how you have it. It protects you from degrading the customer's experience. Basically, discover what users love so you can protect it. The original designs showed us that users care far more about how it works than how it looks, which again, us designers, we don't like, visual designers don't like hearing that, but it's important to remember, don't let decoration and your need to design and put your mark on something get in the way of its functionality, because ultimately users don't care as much about that. We know that something nicer and better makes for a better experience, but it doesn't necessarily always make for a better experience if it isn't actually still functional. And above all else, users prefer clarity. The more clearly you can state something or make something appear, the happier they are. Most of the roadblocks we removed in the experience, it wasn't because we were testing something that wasn't pinging a live server. It was because we just took out all the things that confused people, and then it worked. And it took it down to like a 10-minute process instead of a 45-minute process. And the final thing I'm going to leave you with here is we learned so much from all of the stuff in that design and that prototype that was not clickable, because people still occasionally tried to click on something. And if you have a good test facilitator, they can say to the user, well, so tell me why you tried that. And you learn all sorts of interesting things, because maybe they went off the script that you had intended for them, and they had a good reason for doing that, and suddenly you have all this extra information. You didn't have to build anything extra to gain that information, as long as you ask the right questions. In this case, every test participant spoke out loud their thoughts as much as we could get them to do it. So we knew why they were mousing over things and why they were trying to click on things, and they'd click something and it didn't work, and Jared would say, well, nah, don't worry about that, as we told you, that's just something that's broken right now, but we're really interested in why you did that and what you were thinking was going to happen. What did you expect when you did that? So any inactive elements in a prototype still give you information and tell a story. And ultimately, just build flexible prototypes so that you can make as many iterations throughout the course of the project as you can. It'll benefit you, and if you do this rather than at every version, you test while you're developing. This is pretty easy to test. You could do something like this every week if you wanted to. It's not very complicated. It takes you a couple of hours to prepare the test. And if you're in the middle of building something, why not get a handful of users in, see how it works, make adjustments, try it again the next week. Don't wait for big version numbers. Be as flexible as you can so that you can test more regularly without it being a negative thing. That's it. Hope you enjoyed yourselves, and I'm looking forward to your questions and talking to you later. Thanks.